Good night. You're watching the 2020 edition of the Forum on European Culture, live from the Bali in Amsterdam. My name is Sophie Derksen. I'm a journalist from Amsterdam and a radio host for the Dutch public broadcaster VPRO. Tonight we are speaking with Flavia Kleiner, political activist from Switzerland, and Douglas Murray, journalist at The Spectator and author from the United Kingdom. Central question for tonight: who gets Europe? Will it be, for example, the nationalist politicians that claim national sovereignty? Or will Europe be in the hands of those who call for more European unity and integration? Unfortunately, Douglas Murray had to cancel his trip this morning to Amsterdam. So a digital welcome to Douglas Murray and a very warm welcome here in Amsterdam to Flavia Kleiner from Switzerland. Yeah, you can applaud. I mean, you're present here, of course. Douglas, let's see if you hear us and if you're present with us.
I do, loud and clear. I'm only sorry not to be with you in Amsterdam, which is one of my favorite places to be. But the technicalities of quarantine in the Netherlands, the UK and the US in a few days is too complex to sort out. So I'm sorry not to be with you.
But loud and clear from London, I assume.
Absolutely.
Good. Well, in other words, Flavia and Douglas, the organization of this forum decided to come up with this very delicate question of who gets Europe, and almost immediately decided, apparently, to outsource that problem to the UK and Switzerland. So,
what an idea.
Flavia, let's start with you, because you're here sitting with me. Coming from a non-EU country in the middle of our political union, can you describe us? What does it mean to feel European from a Swiss perspective?
So good evening, everyone, first of all. I'm really glad to be here and to speak about Europe, to feel as a European here speaking about this question. Basically, I would say for me, Europe means freedom and opportunities, and that's something that we, as a non-member of the European Union, just profit as well from it, as well as many Europeans do. And so, yeah, that would be my short answer to your question.
Mm-hmm. You are the founder of Operation Liberal, a political movement aiming to formulate strategies to counter populist methods in Switzerland and throughout Europe. Your tagline is that you have successfully countered a number of populist initiatives and referenda by the Swiss People Party, the biggest party currently in Swiss still. What do you consider your biggest success looking back on those years?
Yeah, so I mean, I have to start at the very moment where we founded this movement, and it was basically a kind of Brexit moment for us, because Switzerland voted in 2014 on a Swiss popular initiative on whether we want to limit the number of people coming to Switzerland within the free movement of people agreement we have with the European Union. And it was accepted by a really close margin of 50.3%, only 20,000 votes made the difference. So that was kind of the wake-up call for us young students who said, well, we don't want to live in a country which comes closer to kind of a free air museum than what we see Switzerland as, for a land of opportunity. So we basically stood up and said we want to fight back this vision of Switzerland. We want to promote our vision of an open humanitarian country, and a country which is eager to tackle actually the opportunities in this free Europe. And yeah, and for this we knew that we have to kind of break the myth which is so strong about the right-wing populists, which pretend that only they can speak for the Swiss people. And so we thought the most effective way to do it is by actually fighting back at the ballot box to win against them in the referendums. And we had to fights about, for example, the expulsion of criminal foreigners. That was one vote they came up with, without actually respecting the principles of rule of law in Switzerland. Or one was on the abolition of public broadcasting, for example. So it was really fundamental questions about liberal institutions we found. So we stood up against that.
On the tactics that you've used and developed over the years, we will speak about it later. For now, I was curious. I read in the Volkskrant this weekend, the Dutch newspaper had an interview with you, that you were surprised by your own successes. Why were you surprised?
Well, the thing is, you know, over the past 25 years, until we kind of stood up, all the other parties became like more quiet and quiet and quiet, because they didn't see how they could actually find a recipe against the right-wing populists winning more and winning more and winning more. So we kind of, you know, just developed strategies, and we couldn't know if we would have any success with it, but then it turned out that we did, yes.
But you've recently quit Operation Liberal. Why?
Right, so after 6 years, you know, and it was a lot of work to build up this movement, which is now present in all Switzerland and which had all these 7 wins against the right-wing populists, I thought it's now a good moment to pass it on to a next generation also of young people, and I am looking forward to tackle some new challenges, maybe also more of an international dimension in my work for defending liberal institutions.
This is the positive answer, but I also read that you retired.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's a tough fight to fight right-wing populists. It's, I think, yeah.
But if activists like you get worn out by the polarization, what does it tell you about present-day Europe?
No, I mean, it's more of a democratic culture that I see endangered. And, I mean, I saw also some boundaries, you know, where I was surprised they would be crossed in Switzerland and in our political discussion. And, you know, I don't know, we came up with these, we kind of countered the fight of the right-wing populists, which made them go, on the one hand, also more extreme. That's just one thing I see, and I think we have to reflect on. But on the other hand, there was no other way for us. We had to respond to these developments, and we wanted to fight back the way the right-wing populists attacked our liberal institutions, because we found that's an achievement which is worth being defended, and so that's what we did.
These liberal institutions are for you very elemental in European identity. You'll elaborate further on that in your speech that we're awaiting, your keynote speech that you'll be giving. But first, I want to switch to Douglas Murray for a brief introductory round with him as well. Journalist at The Spectator and author of, most recently, The Madness of Crowds. In 2016, he wrote the book The Strange Death of Europe, in which he argued that Europe faces an existential crisis of its own making. Douglas, for those present here and online who have not read your book, why do Europeans bring about their own demise? In brief, please.
I will. I'll be as brief as I can be in summing up quite a long book that was the result of an awful lot of research.
I'm taking a risk here, I know, but please try.
But I'll do my best. Yes, the book in question actually, of course, isn't about the EU really almost at all. The EU as a structure does crop up intermittently in The Strange Death of Europe. But really, it's an analysis of what I see as being a set of fundamental questions which Europeans have dodged answering for some years. Let me give you an example of the sort of thing I'm talking about. I was in Doha last year speaking at a debate about migration. We were talking about migration across the Middle East, obviously countries taking in people or not taking in people and so on. And there was a statistic I cited there which remains pertinent, which has come out since The Strange Death of Europe, which was a Gallup poll that was taken last January in Africa. And it found that 1/3 of people in sub-Saharan Africa want to move. Now, that's a very large number of people. It's a number of people that's going to significantly increase in the years ahead. And of course, people in question don't want to move to the freedom of the Middle East. They don't want to move to the Gulf states. They primarily want to move north to Europe, and I don't blame them. My book, The Strange Death of Europe, among other things, just asked very fundamental questions, which is, could Europe, for instance, take all of these people? And currently our leaders and our intellectuals, our thinkers, and our thought leaders are incapable really of answering this question. The answer has to be no, but we don't know how it can be no, because our liberalism, in the good sense, wishes us to be open-armed. Yet we know we can't be. And so we live in this hypocritical state for the time being, which is what I expose, what I write about, and what in The Strange Death of Europe I suggest is a serious contention.
But why exactly is it a strange death?
Oh, lots of reasons. English readers know the phrase to be borrowed from a famous work of a century ago called The Strange Death of Liberal England, which was is a famous work of history in English.
But in this particular case?
It's in this particular case, it's because it is curious. It is curious that Europeans find it so hard to argue for themselves, to defend what is good in their own culture. I think that there's an embarrassment, an uncertainty about who we can share it with. We've basically, among other things, massively overestimated our capacity to bring people in and underestimated the changes that brings about. And by the way, I don't see this as being a right-wing, left-wing thing. It's not a populist versus other people thing. It's a problem and a question that has to be confronted in Europe, and which I try to open out and explore, which obviously has a huge audience of other people who wish to explore it. But there remains a deep unease in the political level across all countries in our continent about how precisely we can talk about this most difficult of issues.
Just to be sure, you mentioned migration as one of the most important threats to Europe, but you also claim in your book that the history of Europe is characterized by immigration and influences from outside. What exactly is the difference then with the immigration today?
I'll give you an example. For instance, in Britain, we still talk about the Norman Conquest. It was quite an important story in the history of these islands. And the Norman Conquest, which happened 1,000 years ago, and as I say, which is still news here, as it were, is thought to have churned about 5% of the population in the UK. That is, that this massive, massive effect that we still talk about of Norman entry into the UK, as we now call it, was around 5% of the population shifted. And when you look at migration post-war in any European country, you're talking about much more significant percentages than that. And so I suggest that in historical terms, what we have been doing in recent decades, not through any particular grand evil plan, but just through incompetence and goodwill and things running away and bureaucracies that don't know how to deal with things and kick cans down the road in order that their successors will deal with difficult questions that they don't wish to deal with themselves. As a result, all of these things have happened. And on a historical level, they are at a speed and at a rate which is highly uncommon in history.
In order to come to an understanding of your idea of Europe as a place, I also quote you, by the end of the lifespans of most people currently alive in Europe, Europe will not be Europe, and the peoples of Europe will have lost, you wrote. Sorry, they will have lost the only place in the world we had to call home. What does this home where you speak about look like or looked like? And why is it in danger? Exactly, who is the danger?
Well, this is a very, very complex matter, as you know, which I write about in considerable length and depth. There's a lot of history to go through, a lot of philosophy to go through, and a lot of recent facts and events. I suggest it's quite obvious that, for instance, in the last census, I'm talking here about the UK because it's the country I know best. I know your country fairly well, but let me give you another statistic from the UK. In the UK, in the last census, which the government does every 10 years, it turned out that people who identified as white British, that is, people who we would have described as British a couple of generations ago, and this isn't to say that people can't become British, of course, but the census a couple of years ago said that people who identified as white British were a minority in 23 out of the 33 boroughs in London. Now, if you were born in the 1960s, say, which isn't that long ago, this means a total transformation of the capital city of the country you're in. Now, I suggest that some people deprecate that, some people love it, most people have a very mixed view towards it, but to pretend that it isn't a very significant change to occur in a lifetime is nonsensical. And I just add one other thing to that. There has been a presumption in recent years in Europe, if I may say so, it's particularly prominent in your own country, to assume that historically, whenever you shake the great Rubik's Cube of humanity, it always comes out looking something like The Hague. That everything ends up in the sort of peaceful, decent, liberal settlement that you happily have in your own country. And I suggest that this is simply a very serious underestimation of, among other things, ideas that people bring with them, how long it takes for people to hold on to ideas, how long it takes to lose them, and particularly the struggle, which I don't need to tell you, your country has gone through a lot in recent years, the serious struggle that liberal societies, in the true sense of the term, have about what they do regarding the integration of people who may not want to join all the elements of the society. What do you do? Our answer is you sort of fudge along for a bit. I suggest that if we solve this sort of problem, it'll be done not by pretending that it's invented by, crazy theorists or something, but by recognizing that there are a set of competing problems that we face, a set of competing virtues is what I describe it as in the Aristotelian sense, a set of competing virtues which in the case of Europe in the 21st century are a competition between justice and mercy. That is, we wish to have justice for people coming, we wish to have mercy to people fleeing other places. But we also need to have a sense of justice for people in Europe who pay their taxes, who have been decent citizens and need to be asked if there are going to be massive societal changes that will take place. Because we're not Petri dishes, we are countries.
Douglas, thank you very much. We have to leave something for people to read your book, so I'll stop you here. Thank you very much.
There's a lot more, I can assure you.
I know. Thank you very much for giving us a slightly brief overview on your ideas on Europe, just for starters. Ideas that will definitely be challenged, I guess, by Flavia Kleiner. Flavia, you prepared a speech for today. I suggest you take the floor to do your speech, and I would absolutely want to invite and encourage the two of you afterwards to really try to engage into a conversation amongst the two of you. We'll get there. Flavia, first, your keynote speech. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So, good evening again. I want to drink Vinho Verde in Lisbon. I want to go there by night train, wearing a leopard-patterned pyjama in a compartment full of strangers. I want to have oranges for breakfast and know exactly where they come from. And I want to know that the workers who picked those oranges got paid for it. And I want to know that their children are going to school whose teachers went to university regardless of how much money they have. I only want to see guns when they're carried around by members of the army or tiny plastic versions of it filled with syrup. I want to remember Srebrenica and read in one of the hundreds of free news outlets that its generals were prosecuted. And I want to look at their faces while they're being walked off to prison. I want to get stuck in a traffic jam and miss an appointment because people are holding a bike manifestation. I don't ever want to smoke weed, but I want to know that in Amsterdam, I could. And I want to have windows that I can open. I want laws that protect me when I am the weakest. I want to be seen, valued, and criticized for what I actually do or did, and not for where I come from. I want to honor the people who died in persecution and our wars by recalling what and who caused those wars. I want to play the game of life by knowing its rules and writing them. I want to have the right to want everything or nothing. And there's only one place in the world where you have the freedom and the possibility to do this. And that's Europe. Because Europe stands for freedom, Europe stands for opportunities and possibilities. But it also stands for dignity, decency, and respect. Dignity of every individual, decency of how we treat individuals, and respect for all the rights of the individuals. These innovations, these values are not superficial attitudes. No, they are the result of having met their opposites. It's the result of having gone through 2 world wars. It's an understanding that was gained through blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Europe learned the hard way, not once, but twice. Only fools and Douglas Murray would give up these lessons learned. Europe stands for each and every one of us because it has to. It's not a private effort based on kindness or generosity. Our individual rights are not at the mercy of a tender-hearted elite. Our individual rights are respected among our states, so we can move around freely on this continent. They're not exposed to the whims of authoritarian leaders, not exposed to the moods of whoever managed to get the grip of power. Our individual rights are protected by the rule of law and can be enforced in front of a court against the state and others who endanger our rights. It's liberal institutions that guarantee our life in a free society, and the reliability of these institutions makes sure we can all count on the rule of law. And it's this confidence that lets us pursue our dreams and seize our opportunities. Nobody follows his or her dream in a state of fear. Nobody meets her or his potential in state of chaos. At the beginning of my speech, and I'm well aware, I told you about what I want from life, about my dreams. Some things might have echoed with your own dreams and others might not. Maybe what you want is very different from what I want for my life. Maybe you would rather not take a night train to Lisbon. Maybe you would rather strengthen the bonds with people and places close to you. Well, you know what? The good news is the freedom and possibility of Europe won't hinder you to do so. Quite on the contrary, you are free to choose how you want to live, how you want to speak, what you want to think. And that's the beauty of a liberal society. You can choose to be non-liberal. But that does not go the other way around. Our institutions protect us from a state of arbitrariness. Let's remember for a second what stood at the beginning of the European idea. A continent in shatters, millions of widows and orphans, a destroyed infrastructure, no food, no heating, no karaoke, yoga, raves on solar-paneled houseboats. Let us try to envision this. It was Jean Monnet, Robert Schuman, and Konrad Adenauer seated at a heavy wooden table, gazing outside through the window onto a demolished continent, consisting of either victims, perpetrators, or bystanders. How to rebuild confidence, how to rebuild even the slightest hint of faith, let alone vision and hope. How to convince the people left that this continent had a future in store for them. A good one, even. Something to fight for, something to believe in. Their common goal, the one thing they all could agree on, the outcome of whether they were going to build had to be never again a war on European soil. And this was the birth of our European institutions. These institutions should make it impossible for a future dictator, power structures or movements to call into question the individual rights of an European citizen, the right to live in decency. Every populist movement has at its center the goal of destroying these institutions. Even though they are often democratically elected, which shows the liberal nature of the democratic system, once in power, they have only one goal: to deconstruct liberal institutions. Right-wing populists like Douglas Murray attack these institutions because they want arbitrariness, they want chaos, they want the rule of law not to be the strongest, but to be the fittest who survives. Because they are part of that small elite, the privileged few. As soon as they get the power, they expose their fundamental illiberal views. They function like a Trojan horse or an evil uncle who arrives with a bouquet of flowers and leaves with the only ways you've had. The Bali is asking us tonight, who gets Europe? I want to remind us tonight that serious democrats already got Europe. They've built it with their own hands. Their passion and love for European citizens and their continent over 75 years ago, and for good reasons. I want to tell us, let us not be intimidated by right-wing populists. Let them explain why they want to attack institutions and values that brought decades of peace, freedom, and prosperity to Europe. Let them explain why we should dismantle that model. But at the very moment, we get involved in a discussion exclusively about migration, nation state, European identity. We are already on the turf of the right-wing populists. I think we should decide on what we want to focus on, where we think the real problems lie. The right-wing populists' arguments are outdated and, frankly speaking, very boring. They do nothing for actually solving problems, such as challenges of climate change. They're not only distracting us, they're wasting our time, and they don't even show up in person. As Europeans, we need to show pride in institutions that exist because of what we've learned from the past. But it's true that many citizens don't relate to these institutions and often don't understand what they stand for. The word institution alone isn't much fun to pronounce, let alone to sing or scream. I've never heard a pop song with a hook line featuring the word institution. Or have you ever seen anyone with a tattoo of the word institution? Ladies and gentlemen, I agree, and I'm fully aware here lies a lot of work that we need to do and must not neglect, because politics needs to speak directly to people's hearts and minds. But populists don't have a monopoly on emotions. Liberalism is based on emotions too. It's based on the profound belief that freedom and equal rights are necessary for any society to prosper as a whole. We need a new generation of people who want to appropriate this project, who see the misgivings, the holes in the walls, the ditches, but who foremost also see the strong fundament of this home called Europe, who see how much light enters through its windows, how well it was placed, how beautiful and fruitful its garden is, how much thinking has gone into it, how hard it was attacked and is still standing, how pointless it would be to tear it down. There is no other place on this planet that will provide us with the freedom and responsibility and possibilities that we are used as Europeans. If we give this up, we will be homeless. If we invest in it, the future is ours. For now, we need to be bigger than what we are. A bit like the sprinter Usain Bolt, whose trick was to envision the finish line at the 110 meters. That's how he ran the 100 meters faster than anyone else, breaking all the records. Thomas Jefferson said, and I paraphrase here, "The price of liberty is eternal vigilance." And here let me come to my last piece of argument. Liberty is not a given. Liberty asks us to accept the responsibility that comes with it. And that's where the battle lies. I think serious democrats across Europe have the responsibility to ensure that the vast majority of citizens understand and connect emotionally to what truly protects them: liberal institutions. Liberal institutions, unlike dictators, don't defend themselves. That's why they're liberal. They need to be defended by us, the people. We all, as citizens of Europe, have to be defenders and thereby the providers of future prosperity and freedom. In a best case scenario, this should be fun, not only a burden. Believe me, and it can be. So I say, welcome to Europe. You've been here all along. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Flavia. Douglas, you have listened to Flavia. I'm curious in the next, let's say, 30 minutes, whether we as an audience will understand better how the two of you come to such different conclusions on the current state of affairs in Europe. Is there anything, for starters, in Flavia's speech that you would agree with?
There wasn't very much in it. What I mainly got was an I want list, followed by a set of claims and rather presumptuous insults. It was hard to find any meat there at all on the bone. That might be because it's rather hard to find any work that Flavia has done other than a tiny campaign in a tiny country. By contrast, of course, it's obviously very much the case that she's read and absorbed everything I've written, which is why she's so happy to be so insulting when she meets me almost in person. So no, there wasn't very much to pick up on other than the rather ill-spoken, ill-lettered and rude attempts to attack me. And I'm sorry about that because I think that it demonstrates her own personal failing as much as it does a failing of the cause that she would like to lead before she got tired and decided to get out. And that is to say this, it's a shame that people like her refuse to engage on any of the important terrain. So much of my time in recent years has been spent engaging with serious actors, with serious reputations, not people like Flavia, people who have spent their life working on these issues and have made very successful political careers, for instance, from doing so. I've always noticed, wish to engage on the serious terrain. When I speak with leading politicians across Europe, who I happen to disagree with, I find that the most important and impressive ones do not get up and read bucket lists of what they'd like to do and then insult people. I find that they try to, for instance, understand what other people are thinking, and particularly try to understand what the public might be thinking. For instance, they might try to work out whether the public is sometimes trying to tell them something, and whether the public who they disagree with might not, in fact, be onto something on occasion. After all, it's very easy to draw rather comfortable lines around yourself and your own ideology, such as it is, and declare that everyone on the other side of it is, for instance, an evil populist or what is it, a fool? That's right, a fool. What an amazing way to speak about somebody else to their virtual face. And what an extraordinary way to speak about majority population votes in our continent. I see very little likelihood of anyone like Flavia, for as long as she remains in the public eye, being able to achieve anything much because she keeps dismissing the public, and the public tend not to like that.
Flavia, your opportunity to respond to that. Let's take up on this last phrase, the public.
Right, I can only say...
Are you reaching them?
I'd say so. I won 7 times against right-wing populists with big majorities. I don't have more to add.
No.
All right, let's see if we can get somewhere with the two of you. Flavia has argued, I would say, as I listened to her, that the best starting point for a European identity would be the liberal institutions. Douglas, what would be your starting point for a European identity?
Well, you have to start at a much more fundamental and deeper level than that.
Does it get any more fundamental and deep, I wonder?
Yes, of course. I think it gets a lot deeper. Before you get institutions, you have to have the ideas and the philosophy that produce such institutions. Institutions do not just land like food parcels in countries.
I agree.
Yeah, so they come from somewhere. So clearly there is a deeper level, despite your attempt just now to pretend there isn't. Clearly there is, so we could agree on that. So the deeper level is, where do the institutions come from? Where are the ideas that the institutions come from? Now, I would say that in the case of Europe, there is a very deep set of ideas which are which you can draw out with some understanding across the continent, and are best seen when you look at the continent from anywhere else. I think to some extent, Flavia's ignorance of my thought is betrayed by the fact she seems to think I'm, among other things, some weird right-wing populist nationalist. Again, she's clearly engaged with none of my work. But one thing I've repeatedly said is that there is clearly such a thing as European identity, because you know it so clearly when you're not in Europe. I've spent a lot of my life traveling all around the world, and as I write in one recent book, there's nothing that makes you feel so close to Europe or so clear about what it means than, for instance, if you're standing in China, as I've done many times. There you see that there are specific philosophical and cultural inheritances that have made Europe what it is, including the liberalism which Flavia abuses or throws around like one of her confetti words, and I think doesn't quite understand. But liberalism in the truest sense in Europe is a distinctly European idea. It's an idea that Europe also gifted in this form to America, which there's a lot more to be said about. But yes, European philosophies and currents of ideas come from a very deep and long-established set of wells. And they are the thing that produce the institutions which, in many cases, we can agree on the utility of, and indeed the virtues of. I think it's somewhat typical of self-proclaimed anti-populists that they pretend that institutions only belong to them, or that their opponents simply wish to pull them down. The one thing I would add to that on the issue of European identity is the considerable, very serious variation that exists across the continent. Again, I've written about this many times. There is a very considerable degree of difference across our continent. It needn't be seen to be some kind of threat. It has been, I think, one of the great virtues of European civilization across the centuries, that the extraordinary range of ideas and cultures exists. But as I say, once you step away from it, you can see that these very disparate and diverse societies do have some very deep wells in common.
Douglas, I'll make some space for Flavia to respond to what you've just said. Flavia.
What is important to me is how I see these institutions, which is precisely that they are kind of the essence of values which we share here in Europe, which, have been consolidated in these institutions. Mm-hmm. And that's why I also think they are so strong and they're so relevant, and we should refer to them and see them as this set of values. They still are, but now found in rule of law and the setup of laws. So that's what I think is so important about this whole idea of institutions, because it's precisely nothing that is politicized that much. The only experience I made, also in Switzerland practically, is that the right-wing populists, they really attack these institutions.
Can you give examples from your practice to make it a bit more concrete maybe for Douglas?
So for example, there was this one law, the right-wing populists wanted to expel criminal foreigners for even minor offenses of law, like driving 2 times too fast within 10 years, which can happen to anybody living in a country, right? So the right-wing populists, they wanted to also exclude any clause of personal hardship. So for example, and you must know in Switzerland, 25% of the inhabitants of the country, they don't have a Swiss passport, but most of them, they have lived in the 2nd or 3rd generation in our country, so they don't really have any ties to where they have their nationality from. But still, they would have been expelled out of the country for even minor infractions of law. So we said we don't want this to happen. That's just arbitrary. Anybody could be expelled for these infractions of law. So we said we need to give the right to a judge this space of just the principle of proportionality to look at the individual case and say, hey, this person has a family here, he has a wife, he has to pay for this family, we cannot just expel him out of the country. And this would no longer have been possible if the law of the right-wing populists was accepted. So we just made this really, really simple case by saying we don't want to live in such a country. And
may I reflect on something?
That was very successful.
Douglas, yes, you have the word.
Very quickly, by the way, I was very interested just before coming joining you, albeit then to be insulted for not joining you by Flavia. I just noticed on the way in that there was a fatal stabbing, as I'm sure you know, Flavia, in Switzerland last Saturday. And the man who just confessed said he did so in the name of, according to Swiss public radio, this isn't according to some weird weird populist movement, but Swiss public radio just said before we came on that that he is a Turkish-Swiss dual national and that he'd been released from prison in July before murdering somebody in Switzerland last weekend, and that actually he'd been on their radar since 2017. Why don't you, when you mention things like you just mentioned, concede that there are some serious concerns that people have, such as, for instance, somebody being stabbed to death last Saturday, and that your presentation of all such concerns as merely being yet more of these right-wing populist concerns actually just might be people who are anti-stabbing, for instance, and you remain totally incapable of giving an answer to such people. But the real problem is this: you were asked a very specific question, then you went on a ramble about a specific Swiss thing. That wasn't the question you were asked. You were asked to provide some meat to the question of what you're talking about when you're talking endlessly about institutions. Which institutions are you talking about, you were asked, and you didn't answer. You started talking about a Swiss campaign. I come back to it. What are the institutions, and are all institutions, once they're created, endlessly virtuous? Or is there ever a time, in your view, that an institution can go bad and that it's quite right to point out that it's gone bad? For instance, when it becomes tyrannical or anti-democratic?
Flavia.
So all I say is what should be at the center of a political order and the interest is, to me, the individual freedom. Before you called yourself a liberal, as I understood you right. And
I don't call myself anything. I'm not going to have you call me whatever you want, so awesome. You can go ahead.
Flavia called you a populist. Would you agree?
No, I mean, it just shows how very unaware she is of almost anything, as far as I can tell. Perhaps this is why there's no body of work that Flavia has produced, clearly, because she doesn't do her research.
That point
I don't think I've ever been reasonably described as a populist.
Sorry.
And I would add one other thing, which is that I don't use the term myself, because I think it's a term used by people who are flabby in their thinking, like Flavia, and simply set up terms in order to then shoot down mythical beasts.
Douglas, sorry, we will give Flavia another opportunity to finish the point. Yes, of course.
I think it's intolerable that you
we have
are mediating a kind of situation where one person is insulting another person. That is not a debate. I think you should intervene and you should be more aggressive and not give Flavia the word and then give Douglas the word.
Good. I think both. Thank you. Thank you very much for your contribution. I think we have a situation where both speakers feel insulted by each other, and let's see if we can get any further than that. As a moderator, I would like to give you, Flavia, again the opportunity to explain this point of the liberal institutions. I understand it so that you say actually they can be your strongest ally if you want to defend liberal values, right?
Exactly.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I just want to come back to the point. What Douglas came up in his first interview round was being afraid of immigration changing European values or European identity. And there I would actually argue that, as I said at the very beginning of starting here to speak, that in these liberal institutions we find the European values, the essence of it, we find it consolidated in these very institutions. And I would say this is basically, that's why I think it's very counterintuitive to me why right-wing populists attack these institutions, which would somehow secure these European values here on the continent, because it's lost, they can be reinforced by states and by individuals. And I would really argue that we should stick and defend these institutions,
yes,
because they also, help people who fear that, for example, Islam or any religion can change the European lifestyle or values here, that we can refer to these institutions.
Right. I would like to know a bit more how actually on a concrete level you suggest to do so, to come up with a narrative, because you also admitted that it is very difficult for people to make an imagination with something as an institution. It's an abstract thing. they don't actually know what they stand for, is what you said. So how does one show pride in institutions, just on a very concrete level? What's the narrative, the moving story, for that matter, that politicians should tell when defending institutions?
I think one point already would be, again, to start explaining why they have been developed, these institutions. It's for a reason, right? It was here to put the individual at the center of interest, or as a goal, the well-being of an individual at the center of our political order. And I am, as a liberal, strongly convinced that this is the right way to go. And I also argue that we shouldn't just stop from putting this at the center of our interest or of our political will, just because some people start to only speak about migration or to start to speak only about national sovereignty, which, in my eyes, rather puts an idea of collective sovereignty at the center of interest and not the individual freedom at the center of interest. And I think that's a really important distinction, because if we look at Brexit, for example, I see that this is actually, people are losing jobs, they're losing possibilities in their life, families are torn apart, and I don't really see how this is in the interest or well-being of an individual. So it's really against that idea. I don't see how this claiming the national sovereignty pays off for people. Let's
put that question to Douglas, right? He is from the UK, so he'll know. Flavia stated on Brexit, if I paraphrase, if sovereignty means let's leave the internal market, you'll lose jobs and therefore chances for individual people, right? Why should sovereignty be the leading principle here, according to you, Douglas?
Sure. I'd just point out before answering that we didn't get an answer still on institutions, but let's park that. Sovereignty of the British people is an extraordinarily important concept, and I think it is in other countries as well. It's clearly something that the British feel particularly strongly about. In recent years, it's been very striking seeing international observers claiming that the British public, for instance, couldn't possibly understand the concept of sovereignty. I know my own country pretty well, and I know that it is a very deep-seated thing that the public do understand. The opinion polls show very clearly, including, by the way, the opinion polls since the vote, show very clearly the extent to which the British public think that sovereignty is the fundamental basis for political order. Of course, it is the case, to cite an institution which, again, we didn't get any, but let me throw one out. There are institutions like, for instance, the courts in Strasbourg, which they're relatively new institutions. They clearly have some conflict with national governments and things, including national security on occasions, and I could bore you with many cases of that. Which mean that, for instance, publics recognize that there are some institutions that are contrary to other institutions, and that the newer institutions might be, therefore, reasonably criticized without being insulted or dismissed or derided. I would suggest that in recent years, the British public increasingly started to feel that they did not know the answer to what Tony Benn, a prominent socialist politician of the last century, described as being the fundamental questions that all people of the left, he said, but I think left and right, we could unite on this, that he said that there are a fundamental set of questions which all publics should be able to have answers to. They included, if you spoke to somebody in power, how did you get power, who can take it away, and several others. This is quite a good distillation of a fundamental point, which is, did the public, shall I say, in Britain feel that they knew who was in power, they had a good say in those people being in power, and they knew how to get them out of power? Now, it was the insight of the British public, and again, I wouldn't deride us all as fools and populists. It was the view of the majority of the British public that we had lost sight of the levers of governance. That is, we looked at Brussels, we looked at Strasbourg, and we saw people that we hadn't put there making decisions over us. We couldn't get rid of them. We didn't know how to get rid of them. There seemed to be no way to get rid of them. Jean-Claude Juncker seemed to be in there for life, whatever happened. And we made a fundamental recognition that there might be troubles in the years ahead, there might be advantages, there are pros and cons to absolutely everything. but that the fundamental issue was that we should be able to know how to get people into power and how to get them out. And that is one of the absolutely fundamental issues of sovereignty. And I think it's a great sadness to me. Anyone who knows my work knows this is my view. It's a great sadness to me that those people who were advocates of the EU were not able to listen over the course of, 3 decades since Maastricht, to the concerns of majority populations, that this fundamental sovereignty issue should have been addressed.
Let's see if Flavia,
that it never was.
Let's see if you helped Flavia to come to a better understanding of your fundamental understanding of sovereignty, because it was a question of yours. Did he make clear for you why sovereignty is the leading principle here, although it's not really benefiting individual
No, for me, not so much. I mean, you quoted on the statistics, which is interesting, but then to me, this is rather a problem of political education, if people don't know what sovereignty means and how it's being created. But maybe I can come up with a different case. Again, I like practical cases, so we can speak about something concrete. And for example, in Switzerland, the population was asked whether we want to accept the kind of, it was really called the self-determination initiative.
You have to explain that one.
It was about placing Swiss legislation over international legislation, a kind of Switzerland first initiative. It would have also caused that Switzerland would have had to step out of the European Human Rights Convention. So just to give you a bit of an idea how, I would say, extreme this demand was, but I mean, it was asked, the Swiss could vote on it, and with a vast majority, we rejected that vote. So again, I would say we discussed broadly about the meaning and the importance of sovereignty in Switzerland in the 21st century, and so the Swiss population said, actually, we see a value in international law, and we see a value in holding our word when we agree on contracts with other states, because we see that it's better to be in close collaboration instead of being isolated as a country.
Just to get you right, in the interview in the Volkskrant, I read that you say, I try to stay away as far as possible from terms as sovereignty and identity. It has become the playground of populists, when I translate it a bit freely. If you start singing their song, you said, you'll lose. What are the words or the lyrics for that method that you use, that you have used? Maybe stay with this concrete case in Switzerland.
Exactly. So we said, in Switzerland, there's this legend that you might know about William Tell. It was written by Schiller.
The guy with the apple.
Exactly, the guy with the apple. But also in that story, you have the three founding fathers of the old Switzerland who stepped together and swore to each other, we will hold our word and we will defend each other if one of us is being attacked. So they did kind of a contract, right? They agreed on standing together. That's the same with international law. But we said it was, if we accepted that law, it was as if one of the three who was swearing was crossing the finger behind the back, right? And saying, I'm telling them now I accept and I stand with them, but actually I won't do it in the emergency case. So it's the same. We said we don't want Switzerland to be a country known for not holding the word. So that's why we try to kind of translate this really abstract principle of international law, of standing together as a community, into what it would mean in an everyday situation. That's how we actually try to promote these values, and I consider it still something important to do in a democracy, in a society, to actually speak about these fundamental principles which make us as a community functioning as a democracy. And again, here we explained a lot the values as they stand in our constitution. And
let me pick up this point that Douglas made, or the question he raised, whether you would reach an audience with this kind of initiatives. Could you tell us, you are from Zurich, but did you have the feeling that with your movement you really reached people who were supporting the Swiss People Party, who are living much more on the countryside?
Yeah, I mean, after all, in a democracy, the majority wins. So for us, it was clear we don't need to try to convince the right-wing populists as a first audience. But what we surely managed was to convince, I would call, a conservative middle ground, which is in many societies, that's the big chunk of people who vote this way, who think this way. And I think it's very fair to be conservative, that's not my problem. I just say I get a problem if you start to support and that's what you do if you vote yes with the right-wing populist initiative. If you start to support their attacks on the liberal institutions, and we time and again made that case and challenged the views of the right-wing populists on this. And I think by making this, we strengthened again the understanding and the civic education about what is the importance of the individual rights, of separation of powers, just the points, that I think every citizen should understand about the system.
We're back at the institutions. We made a round trip. We were 1 hour on the way, so I would like to open up for questions from the audience, if there are any. Don't leave me hanging here. You came all the way to the Bali. Anyone?
Ella.
Otherwise, I'll just continue. Yeah, I see a hesitating question over there. Just dare to stand up? No, you don't dare anymore. Okay, then I'll just continue. Really sure?
I would like to come in with a question.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I think Douglas has a question, but we were also looking for questions from the audience, but no.
I agree.
Good. Then this was your chance. Then we go to Douglas with, I would suggest a final question to Flavia then, and then I'll come back to you.
Sure. I mean, one of the most important educational tools, I'm sure you know, to try to encourage young people to engage in democratic debate is for them to see that their opponents or their debaters are not evil people who deliberately wish to pursue wicked ideas, but are fellow citizens whose concerns need to be listened to and perhaps even acted upon. What I'm interested in is whether you see the conundrum that faces you when you describe people as right-wing populists. And again, I would quite like a definition of what you mean by populist, because it's a word that I don't use myself because I think it's too inexact to use. But what do you mean when you refer to these right-wing populists? And whether you can, as it were, be in a country with them where they would win, because your definition of right-wing populists would appear to, for instance, take in the majority of my country. You said you had no problem with conservatives, which one might dispute, but what would you do once you had described your opponents as right-wing populists, tried to make a binary in which you stand on the good side and the evil right-wing populists stand on the bad side? What would you do on those occasions when they are onto something? When, for instance, a sovereignty question is serious or a migration question is serious? How can you interact with them, having demonized them to the extent that you wish to do?
Flavia, do you feel that you're demonizing populists?
Not at all. I just said, and maybe you didn't hear it, Douglas, but I said in a democracy, the majority wins, and I'm very well aware that this is the rules. So by actually throwing myself into these battles, which I did on the very grounds of a democratic interaction, and I, worked with my own hands, I actually, accept that game, and I try to find the better arguments, the more convincing language, and I did. So to your question, how I define right-wing populists, I, of course, would say that right-wing populists to me is people who claim for themselves that only they represent the true will of the people. And I can tell you in Switzerland, we had elections where the right-wing populists, the Swiss People's Party, had ads where it was written on real Swiss vote for the SVP, where I would say, well, I'm Swiss too, and I would never vote for your party. And that's, to me, the very case. I mean, I just want to say again, I totally respect that democracy, it's about the majority, and that's why I see, and that's also what I claimed in my speech, the responsibility lies in our very hands. I'm also just saying, well, I buy into that game. I think we need to defend it. We have to do it. We cannot think that institutions just fall from the sky and that they are untouchable, they will never change. That's not the case. I'm very well aware. That's why I claim active citizenship and I ask people to engage, and I also live it and want to represent this. And here, just one last point, I mean, about Brexit and Brexiteers. I would say, Douglas, and maybe I'm very provocative about it, but I want to challenge that everyone who voted for Brexit for the very same reasons that you did. I don't think you can speak for all the Brits that you would call the majority.
I don't claim to. I simply refer to the opinion polls that prove what I just said, which is that sovereignty was the fundamental issue that united the British people on the 2016 Brexit vote, and that it shouldn't be dismissed, that it should be understood. There is always a remarkable thing in political science, that people are the thing that they accuse other people of. I've heard tonight nothing but an endless set of claims about what Europeans should be, and they all seem to have to be like Flavia, otherwise they are right-wing populists. This claim that this is exactly what the right-wing populists do is precisely what you have spent the evening doing yourself, which is to say anyone who doesn't agree with me is not in touch with the deep people of Europe.
Good.
And I don't think that's a reasonable way to go forward.
So, Douglas, I'm really sorry. I'll suggest that we quit the insulting game for now.
No, I wasn't at all insulting. I was simply making a point against an error by my opponent.
And can I just clarify that I came
Last
here
point,
invited?
Flavia, and then we go to the audience.
I was invited here for a debate, and as much as I know about debates is that each of the debaters prepares a speech. I did it, you didn't. I was expecting your view to be presented this way, so I prepared myself this way. So I'm still hoping I can hear more.
In order to hear more, we will go to the audience. I see one question over there, one over here. So we have two ones, right? And then we wrap up. Yes.
First off, thank you to both the speakers and the mediator. I really enjoyed the debate so far. I actually have a question to Flavia.
Yes.
If I misquote you or misphrase you, please interrupt me. But during your speech, in the beginning, you said that one of the things you admired, or one of the liberal ideas you stand for, is that we don't have to agree, and that's the beautiful thing of liberalism. Then one of your final quotes was, I don't have a problem with conservatives unless they attack liberal institutions. The liberal point you stand for is that we can disagree, and that's a good thing. And in that sense, it's also okay with you if you disagree with conservatives. And you draw a line when they attack liberal institutions. And I don't mean to be annoying, but I'd like an example of a liberal institution that you don't want to be attacked. You say, well, I draw the line at attacking institutions. And since that's apparently the line of free speech or debate for you, then I would like to know where exactly this line would be drawn according to you.
Yes, thank you so much for this question. You know, just to maybe illustrate more clearly what I mean by liberal institutions or the values I want to see protected through the work I did, it's kind of the carpet we're on, you know, and as long as we remain on this carpet, as long as we don't attack really the simple basic, values, which is, for example, equality before law.
So that's an institution you see as a value?
Exactly.
Okay, so not necessarily formal institutions such as the European Union or...
No, I mean it really as well as this, but thank you for this question. So again, if I get back to the case, because I explained it already, people who don't have a Swiss citizenship, but who would, if I as a Swiss would drive 2 times too fast within 10 years, I would get a fine, maybe 100 Swiss francs. And if somebody with no Swiss passport would be expelled out of the country, if that law would have been accepted. So for me, this is clearly, living in Switzerland is not equal before law anymore. And this value in the Constitution should not make a difference whether you are a Swiss citizen or whether you're not a Swiss citizen. And so that's where actually I start to disagree and where I strongly fight for this liberal value or institution, I would call it in a broader sense. Do you understand better what I meant by my argument? Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you for clarifying with your question. We have another one up there. Yes, maybe you can just speak very loudly, or the micro. For the live stream. Sorry, we have to record you. So you can think once more about your formulation.
Thank you. One question to both of the participants. First, one to Flavia. Flavia, is there a valid reason for a citizen to not want any immigration to their country or town? And one to Douglas if there was a theme earlier amongst the rate of change. You raised the point of the 5% in the UK with the Normans. Is it not just changing that everything's changing really quickly nowadays? And so if there's a lot of change with immigration, we've got smartphones now and we didn't have that 20 years ago. So it all washes out, all comes out in the wash.
Let's start with this one, I would suggest, to Douglas Murray, and then we'll end with Flavia.
Is that the end, can I ask? Or?
I would suggest it is the end,
okay.
Yes.
Fine. Let me answer. Yes, that's a very interesting question. It is possible. We do, of course, live in a time of extraordinary change. The technological change that the questioner just rightly referred to is perhaps the most fundamental of all in the era that's gone unaddressed this evening. The extraordinary benefits and negatives of living in an era where we all have access to all of the information in the world at the tap of a finger. It's an enormous blessing, and it brings a lot of problems. And yes, there is an extent to which you can say that. I would say that, however, churn of populations, that is significant population change, is one of the most significant changes. We know this, and we talk about it historically. When large movements of people happen in history, we who write about history reflect on them still. There are things like the Huguenot movement in the 17th century to my own country, which is still talked about. And that was a relatively small movement of people, but it's mentioned because it was quite an important thing at the time, albeit only 50,000 people then. So it's true that these things have all sped up. It's true that the question of migration, we haven't really got onto it tonight at all, but the question of migration is a complex one. It isn't simply something like open borders versus right-wing populists. It is one that, as I say in The Strange Death of Europe, goes down the heart of each one of us, as well as down the heart of our society. It's an exceptionally complex question. But as I say, I go back to this point that even with everything else that's changing in the world, the population change is the most long-lasting such change, because people are not all the same. They don't all bring the same ideas. They don't bring the same culture. They don't bring the same religions or anything else. And there are upsides to that and downsides to that. As I said earlier, you can deprecate it or praise it, but most of us think that it's a somewhat mixed bag. If this is, by the way, to be the last round, I would just mention something very quickly. Flavia said that I hadn't prepared a speech. I do indeed have a speech here. I haven't been called upon to use it tonight, but my notes sit in front of me. I don't quite know, yet again, why that attack should be made. And I would just add one other thing, which is that it is my experience that I turn up to events and broadcast in when quarantining rules do not allow me to turn up to events, in a spirit of genuine openness to ideas. It's one of the great founding liberal ideas that we engage with each other. And I would just make this one point. When Flavia stood up and described me as stupid or a fool, she said, and then talked about arguments I make as boring, elitist, I've rather lost count of the number of insults she did. That is to not engage in that fundamental liberal spirit of debate. And so I'm very sorry myself that her decision to open this evening by being rude should have meant that some certain curtness might have been needed in reply. But I would hope on other occasions that she would join me in the spirit of genuine liberal thinking.
Okay, that point has been made. Thank you, Douglas. We have the last question for you, Flavia, from the audience. Is there a valid reason not to have any immigration, not to be supporting immigration? Right, that was your question.
Yeah, thank you also for your question. I would like to say that if there's one thing that has been constant to us as a human, race, it's migration. People are moving because they take decisions, and it's their right to move. And I think we have this is just a fact also which is happening. I would say, as Douglas said, it's a complex question about migration. And my point really just is to say that, migration will affect our society, but I'm not sure if it will affect our society as strongly as technology will, for example, or climate change. And, sometimes if I also look at conservative parties, and some follow these right-wing populist claims that are being made. I wonder, why are they also against development aid, for example? Or why are they not taking any measures against climate change? Because they could. They're in parliament. These are also just fields which affect a lot migration, especially from Africa, I would say. And so that's just where I would play the ball back, because that's one thing where I don't see any answer coming up. And again, I just want to say that I'm standing here, I'm debating, I think, with Douglas Murray, and I didn't call him a fool. I just said there are fools, and there's Douglas Murray who would give up on these values, because that's what I heard from you in the conversation in the very first beginning of the speech.
You decided to insult me before you listened to me, but there we are.
I listened to you and then I spoke.
I would say this was a debate. However, thank you very much, Douglas Murray, for joining us. Thank you very much, Flavia Kleiner, and thanks all of you here and all of you at home watching the live stream. This is it for tonight. Thank you very much for being here, and please do check out the YouTube channel for more from the Forum on European Culture. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.